So now is our opportunity to kind of synthesize all this very diverse kinds of thinking that we've been seeing throughout the day. And we are going to have, we called it a round table, but it's sort of more rectangular here. And we're going to bring in Andrew Wolf, the director of the museum here, to moderate some of our speakers from today. Allison, Pierre, and Chris. And then we are also bringing in two experts locally, Amy Pilling, who I saw here. And she's a permaculture designer, educator, and artist living in Santa Fe. And Amy has worked with us at Biocultura, doing wonderful mycelium cultivation workshops with some of our students, and is working on a project called the Living Arts Lab, which is going to be a mobile DIY biolab that's going to travel throughout the state to some of the places and hopefully do what we've been talking about, is invigorating youth to understand and be interested in biology. So welcome, Amy. And if people could come up, as I'm sort of saying, that would be great. And also, we had an extra, so the bios for everyone are here, but then there's a second page that we had to add to, not enough room for everyone's bio. We're also welcoming to the roundtable Christine Mackey. And Christine is a Fulbright scholar who joins us from Ireland, and she's in residence at University of New Mexico. She is an artist who works with ecosystems and systems biology in her work, and we're happy to welcome her at my lab, the social media work group, working with STEAM New Mexico. And so I will stop there and sort of bring.
Can you turn off the...
Oh, yeah, that would be great, yeah. So I will hand it over to Andrew to engage us in conversation.
Thanks, Andrea. I keep going back to the title of the conference as a refuge and a starting point to an attempt, a synthesis with the help of all of you of what we've talked about today, what you've talked about today. And I just want to reiterate the title of the conference, which is I Love Life, Celebrating Biodiversity Through Art and Science. And from the Navajo Blessing by Andrew this morning, his earnest hope and wish for peace and balance, I think was definitely the correct tone to begin today's proceedings. And we went straight into Miguel's New Mexico DNA project. Has Miguel already left? He's gone?
He had to go to...
Oh, well, I'm going to recruit Miguel for a September symposium here at the museum. Yes, on the history of the Pueblo Revolt, the Reconquest, and Fiesta itself. So you'll see Miguel again, hopefully, if he accepts. And then we moved into the origins of life with Chris. We had lunch, and then we came back to talk with Allison about the universe as an operating system, a framework for creating art, and we finished up with Pierre's Future of Conservation Biology. I was reminded from today's talks about another scientist. I don't know if Diderot is thought of as a scientist or more as a writer of encyclopedias. I'm looking at Pierre.
Diderot, I'm sorry. Diderot, yes. No, he was not a reader. He was a friend of...
Well, I consider myself like Diderot, a friend of science, and definitely not a scientist. But Diderot was a prominent Enlightenment-era writer and thinker, and his legacy rests on his tireless efforts as chief editor of the Encyclopédie, or Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers. And in his introduction, he declared the aim of the project was to change the way people think, and that all things must be examined, debated, investigated, without exception and without regard for anyone's feelings. So I felt that we accomplished some of that today with all of your participation and with the participation of our noble audience. And I think what I would like to do first, just to attempt to be gracious for a moment, is to have Amy and Christine introduce themselves, and please share whatever you like in relation to our theme today of I Love Life.
I am a trained permaculture designer. I worked as a permaculture designer with mostly residential climate clients for years, but I have a background in media and the arts. And in more recent years, I've been more and more interested in the arts, and I am back in school. I'm actually in school at the local community college because it's very accessible. They have a great sculpture studio. And a lot of the work that I am doing or want to do involves biological processes or hidden processes in nature or hidden forces in nature. So I'm working right now with magnetic fields and seeing how to sculpt magnetic fields. And I've been working with mycelium, and I'm wanting to work with slime molds. But my biggest challenge is that I live in a very small house, and I've been trying to do this in my kitchen, or I would have, access during a part of a semester to, do a project, and I'd have to truncate the work because my grad student would leave, or I wouldn't have access. So I decided I wanted to make my own laboratory. So I wrote a grant to create Life Arts Laboratory, which is a little mobile biolab. So that's what I'm in the middle of doing. Instead of having fun here, I was actually trying to plasma cut stainless steel, but it's too windy, so it's getting dangerous to do it. So I'm fabricating it down at the community college, and the idea is to have it be a lab that's for artists and scientists to take out on the road to schools that don't have equipment or access to teachers, and be able to introduce people to new concepts. So that's my focus right now.
Yes. And for my own edification, could you please tell me what a permaculture designer does?
It's a sustainable design practice that's mostly, the easiest way to describe it is systems design. So you're looking at the environment and not only designing for the client, but designing for what the environment needs so it meshes well. I think that's probably the simplest way to describe it.
Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Christine?
I work full-time as a visual artist. Normally, I'm based in Ireland, currently based in UNM, Fulbright. Normally, my work is attends to the subtle ecologies of place, people, and plants, and I look at the antagonistic relationships that are developed and the narratives between all of those and themselves. Why I'm here in New Mexico is I'm developing new projects, and they hinge on a historical period in America called Gamma gardening in the 50s. And I'm looking at that as a kind of process in terms of the control of biological matter, and I'm looking at how some of those legacies still exist and what that means in terms of the politics of seeds. So I come from a more political background than a scientific background. All the narratives around that as well. So that's the premise.
Thank you very much. There are so many incredible thoughts that were uttered today that I'm just trying to kind of funnel down to some thoughts that I can throw out to you, and I want you all to feel free to talk amongst yourselves, and if the audience would like to ask questions too, please open it up. Today we heard about the central dogmas of on origins of life. And we also, I think, heard about some dogmas on the endings of life. And I would like to go back to the idea that Chris introduced about, I think it's the Drake equation, which basically says we're lucky to be here, right?
Potentially, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we are. But like Fermi also said, where is everybody? No, I'm just joking. Maybe Pierre and Chris could talk about how your work, and I'm trying to help you maybe guide an answer relative to the theme of I love life. How your work corresponds to that. It seems one of you is obviously very interested in origins, and one is trying to keep at bay endings.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm going to start.
Please.
I think what you do is extremely important, and that without what you do, I wouldn't be able to do the job that I'm doing, because I was talking about the value of understanding, basic mechanisms even in mammals, but if we don't even understand, the origin of life, how do you want to describe and understand really biodiversity? So this is, to me, this is extremely important. So thank you for doing that. I know you're not biased. It's not you, you and your colleagues.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think listening to your talk, one of the things I was thinking about is, if you think about the history of life, life as a thing seems amazingly resilient, right? Once it got started, it stuck around. There's many forms. There's tons of diversity. But the individual species is incredibly fragile, right? And so I think, most species that have existed have also gone extinct. And so I think, yeah, so it's sort of which we care about, right? If we care about life as a thing, it's probably going to stick around on this planet. But if we care about a particular species, say us or all mammals even as a class of organisms, that's much more fragile. And I think Allison's, bringing up this Carl Sagan quote about this tiny speck of dust and a, bit of sun highlights how small our system is, how hard it is to go somewhere else, and the fact that although life persists, bacteria certainly persist, we should be very careful about how fragile, say, mammalia is. So that, I mean, that's the main thing I was stimulated by thinking of both, hearing both of your talks. So,
That's
yeah.
true. That's true. But what you explained also, was that you? You explained that when you look at the tree of life, right now it's a really simplified tree, but there were a lot of branches that didn't go anywhere, and the dinosaurs disappeared. It's not our fault, I think. It's a lot of trial error, and it's beautiful because I think it's a constant evolution. The problem we have with this kind of assertion is that sometimes people are telling me, but maybe the giant panda is such a big bear, so stupid, and why is he eating bamboo? Maybe he's at the end of an evolution. Just let it go, and it's. But no, we can't do that because we know that we reached a point of endangerment for that species because of our activities. It was not necessarily showing any weaknesses or whatever. It was probably thriving, and a lot of so. So that's always the kind of argument that sometimes we have to face about the fact that evolution of life, but some species are so fragile because highly adapted, but still I think we have absolutely no say about the future of those species to protect what we have right now. So.
I was recently reading for fun, actually, Arthur C. Clarke's short story, The Sentinel, which he wrote in '48, and it was really the precursor to 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it's only about 5 or 6 pages long, but it depicts astronauts and I can't remember which moon they're on, but they're on a moon, and they come across a pyramidal structure that they can see still has this kind of ancient force field around it because of the pileup of dust around it, but that it's not sending any signals any longer, that it was potentially wiped out by an atomic blast, nuclear blast. I guess the moral of that story, in a very simplified sense, is that structure, which of course in the film was the what do we call it? The monolith, thank you, was a warning beacon to any who would encounter it later. And we've talked about extinction of plants and animals and dangers to biodiversity in different talks today, but and we've also talked a little bit about politics and how politics can certainly shape policy when it comes to how we look at biodiversity. But I'll throw this out to the entire round table. What would you think are some of our warning beacons today concerning biodiversity? Let me just say, you are such a diverse group that it's amazingly difficult to come up with questions to throw at the likes of you.
Well, there are many, I mean, yeah, there are a lot of signs showing that, but as you said, I mean, this is awesome how nature is so resilient and can regenerate. And I believe that even if we have really pushed maybe a little bit too far in some of the ecosystem, I think we're still okay. We were talking about that yesterday, about, food production. When we say, oh yeah, well, how are we going to be able to feed, 10? Actually, we are already producing enough food to feed 10 billion. The problem is that in the Western world, we are wasting a lot of that food. But we already, so it's okay. I think it's fine. And as long as we find a good compromise, and I think that's true that sometimes there are some red flags going, oh, okay, wow. Extinctions of species are, the problem is that we are missing a lot of species also that we haven't, first of all, they haven't been discovered, but probably they are going extinct and we have no idea about that. So it's really difficult for us also to know exactly.
I'd like to chime in with a slightly different approach, and that is that I'm greatly concerned about the ever-increasing disconnection of young people with nature in general, and just, through your talks, a lack of access to education about it. And that's what I'm focusing on more and more. I was having a conversation with a distance math teacher who works in Colorado and New Mexico. She lives here. And she said in a 300 square mile radius or area in Colorado, southern Colorado, there's one science teacher and there's no science equipment. So that teacher is trying to travel from school to school with almost no equipment, trying to educate these students, and it just seems physically impossible. So those students growing up are going to have almost no education, basic science. And I think the same holds true for math and the arts and other things. So to me, I have, great concern about what's happening through the education system, decreasing funding and greater screen time, less time in nature. Nature deficit disorder is, as it's been phrased, but I think that's a growing problem because we're not going to be preaching to the choir, we're going to be preaching to people who have absolutely no idea what they're missing.
Sometimes we have to go to great lengths today to get that education for our children. We purposely moved from a city of 8 million to a town of 80. And we're loving every minute of it. And we've changed school districts twice now, living in New Mexico in 3 years, so that our daughter could get math, science, music, and art. So we drive an hour each way. Funny enough, the school's in Los Alamos. Well, do well with science at Los Alamos. But yes, I concur completely. I have something for Chris, and I read this on your bio. I think it's on the SFI website. It says, Chris's work on trees has applied a theory of plant architecture to derive individual physiology, interactions with the environment, and the unique whole forest structure of specific regions. This is theory that goes from individual branches to planetary scale energy balance, but does so in a way that uses a small set of common principles and assumptions. So I find that an incredibly vast undertaking that you're attempting, and I think that dovetails with Allison's work with plants as symbols, also as art. Could you talk to that a bit, going from the cellular plant cellular level to the uber macro?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, more generally, the perspective is of biology has often been you have these evolutionary processes that create lots of individual species that are very well adapted to particular environments. And that's very true. But as I showed with microbes today, if you kind of zoom out and look across all of that diversity, you often see these single relationships that apply to entire groups of organisms. And those single relationships often tell you about the mechanisms underlying that system that are most important for evolution, right? And so for plants, similar types, I didn't show them today, but similar types of relationships exist. And so what they basically say is that if you have this fractal-like architecture, and this is, older work by people like Jim Brown and Jeffrey West and Brian Inquist, but if you look across various scales of plants and think about their optimized architecture for, say, light uptake and water uptake in the root system, then you do get these single relationships. And it can be understood for trying to sort of optimize that connection. And so what we've done then is to take that and say, well, how does that interact with the environment? So how does the architecture of the canopy interact with sunlight and the sort of energy balance of the atmosphere? And how does the root system interact then with some sort of ability to uptake water? And then doing that, you can then usually have a very small set of parameters, sort of knobs that you can turn in some system that tell you, say, what's the maximum height of a tree in a particular environment, where all you know about that environment is, say, annual temperature and how much precipitation is falling and what the humidity is, things like that. And so we then have been able to use that to predict lots of biogeographic features using just the local climate. And so that's kind of at the other end of the spectrum from lots of modeling, which says, let's put in tons of individual species and lots of parameters and try and explicitly model an individual forest. And the trouble you can sometimes get into with that is that you have so many parameters, it's hard to make very long-term predictions because you're afraid you might have sort of overfit one environment. And so our hope is that these kind of average mechanisms allow you to make very general predictions about, say, how a forest will respond to a small change in temperature. And then you can couple that with, say, feedbacks in the environment, with the atmosphere, and start to understand the interaction of regional biogeography or regional sort of forests with the climate system, and think about what happens to that feedback long term. But to Allison's work, it's very much about focusing on the structure first and thinking about what is it about the biological morphology, what does that tell us about what's been optimized over evolutionary time through this evolutionary process, and what are the sort of main physics or processes that matter. And so, I really enjoyed your perspective on that.
I was just going to say what you said was so incredibly smart that I have no desire to follow it. It's really awe-inspiring.
Just to go back to Allison's work, I'm with you. Let's hang together. It's okay. You referenced the Eden growth model, which I found quite fascinating. In my life, I've spoken to and worked with a number of people for various reasons in architecture and city planning, and you referenced the Eden growth model. Is it that Eden growth
Yeah.
model as kind of a predictor of how plant life grows, how cities grow? And I'm wondering, has that informed city planning in your knowledge? And, you know, if that is always the case, that it tends to grow exponentially based on this kind of shape, like flying over any smaller town in Europe or any major city anywhere in the world, are city planners going against the grain and planning conversely to the Eden growth model?
I mean, I have not done analyses like that, but I can say that part of the reason that I do the work I do is to inspire more of bringing nature into a dialogue with the built environment, and so bringing nature in and thinking about choices that we're making. And so I'm not really sure exactly how to answer that one because I haven't done that research, but I don't think it's a matter of going against the grain. I think it's more about awareness, and awareness is, the way that any transformation could happen if we did want there to be one.
3 words that were repeated several times during your various talks were awe, wonder, and curiosity.
Yeah, those are big deals to me.
Yes, to you, what is awesome? What is the most curious, and what is wondrous or wonderful, and what are next steps in your work?
Yeah, well, I can speak to, growing up, I felt that I didn't have a lot of connections with nature. I felt like we moved around a little bit more than I, would have liked, and was kind of put into these new, empty boxes in the suburbs, and really kind of didn't feel the connection that I wished that I had. And so I think that's where my kind of re-inspiration or reintroduction into wanting to make people care and be excited about plants comes in. And I, ending up in a digital media program where people were doing computer art, it was like, oh no, it's more of this. And that kind of echoes, is it Amy? Her initial statements about, how to solve the problem. And I think if we can inspire young people to want to get into the level of detail about how living systems work to the same degree that maybe they're figuring out video games, for example, like having them be driven by data and models from real information, and have fun with it as one way to take computer art, but really also to think about expanding what that area of interest is, and that's where I tried to focus my talk.
And I noticed, I couldn't help noticing that you're willing to let your work perish.
Yeah,
But-
it's definitely performance-based
Right.
in that regard, and a lot of work to produce as well. I don't know, it's just kind of built into my whole raison d'etre.
Thank you. And to take one of Pierre's thoughts about being conscientious gardeners of the planet, Allison, again, one more. I'm just curious, are you a gardener at home? Do you actually?
I have a lot of indoor houseplants. Yes. I live in a studio apartment that's maybe 15% plant.
I was just curious. Christine, I'd like to go back to you. Again, same question to you. What is, beyond what you've already described in just a few seconds, but what are you looking forward to in your work? You did mention your work does have a political sense to it. I think you said that. Mm-hmm. And what are you most curious about?
I guess I'm really interested in historical processes in a scientific context and how they impact on